Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis? I feel like we were just here, but I'm back and I'm trying to figure out a way to do this a little bit better than yesterday so that I can hopefully get into bed before 2 a.m. tonight. So I'm going to do a little more bite-sized pieces. Right now they're at lunch, but I'm still pretty behind on testimony. And I just didn't want to get behind a whole hour and a half like I did yesterday. It really threw me off. I've got a busy afternoon. My son is going to get his restricted license. So really exciting day around here. Also very scary. He's going to be driving my new Jeep truck that I got days ago. But anyways, I trust him. So cross your fingers. He passes. He is one excited kid this morning. Also, just want to explain how I do my episode numbers. So for example, on Monday, there was no testimony. It was just going through the evidence. So I didn't do an episode that day. Tuesday, not yesterday, Tuesday, we had those two really short witnesses. Wasn't enough for an episode, barely enough for a YouTube short. So I added them onto yesterday's testimony. So I'm only numbering the episodes that there's testimony going on. So that's why some of the other channels have it listed as a later day. But for me, it would have been confusing if I skipped a day because they're running every day the cameras are on, whether there's testimony or not. So I wanted to clear that up for you guys. I've had a lot of people confused. My bad. I really should have explained it a lot sooner than day 40 something in the trial, but there we go. Before we get started, music fact of the day. Did you know back in 1984, ZZ Top was offered $1 million for each member if they shaved their beard for a Gillette commercial? And they were like, yeah, not going to happen. So I thought that was interesting. $1 million, I'd shave my head. Anyways, so let's jump into it real quick so I can get back to taking notes. We picked up with George still on direct with defense attorney Parker. So he shows George a photo of Billy at the house on Peterson in the kitchen. He asks if he used Facebook. And I don't know why he showed the picture of Billy and then asked him about Facebook, but he said if he used Facebook, it was off and on, and he mainly only used it for Facebook Marketplace and diesel groups. He used Facebook Messenger, though, to talk to people. One friend of his was Frankie. He's asked if he ever blocked Frankie on Facebook. Remember, the very first day, I believe, in openings, prosecutor Canepa had the graph showing with the arrows who blocked who on there, and it had George as blocking Frankie. George said, to his knowledge, he did not block Frankie on there. Canepa's objecting like twice. The judge overrules it. So George doesn't know if Angela had his password or not, and the defense hands him that exhibit of Angela's little book of passwords. And he flips through it and says he knows the cover, doesn't really know the contents, and it was kept in the kitchen. So then they show George the GoFundMe that Jake put up. He said he had not seen that until it was provided in discovery after his arrest. Then they get into the photo of the wolf with a tattoo over the eye, and one has a miscolored eye. There was actually a little hearing right before testimony started about this where Canepa really wanted it to be that the wolf has one eye, and that relates to Kenneth. And the judge looked at it and said, it looks like he's got a scar. Doesn't look like his eye's out. So the state mentions the fact that Chris Newcomb testified when he was on the stand that when he saw it, it kind of made him stop in his tracks. And Judge Deering said, well, that's Chris's interpretation of it. He said he didn't see anything about it that led him to believe it was a one-eyed wolf. And so anyways, they had that little saying. And so they read the reply. Angela says, really? And George says, what? Don't like it? George said that as a child, he was terrified of wolves. And he said he wasn't at Left Fork Road that night or even in the area of the murders. George said he didn't trust Beth for different reasons. Number one, she broke up with Jake and got back with him, even though she knew what people were saying about his family. And he thought that was odd, that she would choose to be with someone accused of those things. Also, she told them about her childhood. She was apparently in a cult in Texas. And George said She told them the church sold the kids into sex slavery. Vine said Beth told them that George shot bad people with his AR. There's an objection to that as well. Wiretaps, they talk about the discussions that George and Jake had about Beth as well as Angela. He wanted Beth out because he didn't feel that Vine was safe around her. George, they kind of hop around here. He's tying up loose ends because he really doesn't go too long this morning. But George explains that he was the one that gave Sophia the nickname Suds. She was sitting in a bucket of soapy water, and it started out as Sophie Suds and eventually just got cut down to Suds. Anytime George would say Sophia acted or looked like or made a face like Hannah Mae, Jake would get really upset, really mad, didn't want to hear it. So he's asked about Tabby now raising in current time their son, Vine. He said as long as she straightened her life up, he has no problem with her raising Vine. George and Tabby had a favorite tree they went to go sit in when they would deer hunt. It was a hollowed out tree. And he went to all the fairs and festivals, even if he went alone. He just loved going to those and didn't care if somebody came or not. He was going. He said he noticed that Billy drank more after the murders than he did before. And the heaviest George said he had been in his life was around 320. He took diet pills to lose weight, and he got those from pill farms. And also he said when they work for a while and then they stop working. And so you have to go off of them and kind of give your body a chance to reset. And then by the time your body has reset, you're gaining your weight back. So he said it was more of a money trap for him than anything, the diet pills. And it was just a gimmick. So they talk about what he said yesterday, considering Hannah Mae a little sister. He said they went hunting together. They would go fishing, four-wheeling. They would go to fairs. He said they talked about personal issues, and he confided in her about his insecurities with his weight, or if he had a bad week with Jake or Angela or Tabby. And she did the same with him. He changed his phone number before the move to Alaska. He waited for the service to run out. So at one point he had two phones where the service was almost out, but he needed another phone. He also said that he changed it coming back from Alaska into the lower 48 because his attorney advised him to. He said he offered to pay for Tammy to come to Alaska to see Vine, and she never did come. George said the similarities of the trauma when someone has been sexually assaulted was obvious with Tabby and Beth both. He said Tabby and her sisters thought it was normal, and if it would have happened to another kid, such as Vine, the kid would get over it if it did, in fact, happen. George said he had an issue with Angela trying to look over his shoulder, trying to get his password. So he changed it daily. I'm thinking he meant like the code to get in the iPhone. He said that started when he first got his very, very first iPhone many years ago. So on Peterson Road, he made money by cutting up trucks like a chop shop. So his grandpa Carter had people who would come by with diesel trucks who just couldn't make the payments. And so George would chop it up and the parts would be sold and then reported as stolen to insurance. So then the defense shows George an exhibit about the computer taken at the border in Montana. And he said that Jake had an Apple computer and Angela mainly used the iPad. So he wasn't super sure about this particular computer that was confiscated. He couldn't really remember it well. He said he used his phone on Facebook and he had an Acer computer, but he only used it to look at trail cameras and not for anything else. He wasn't super savvy with the computer. So they move on to the custody documents that were signed in April of 2016. George said he came in one day and Angela said she was filling out one for Jake and asked if he wanted one since the only one he had at that time was a handwritten agreement of, if something happens to me and Tabby, you get Vine. That was what he had at that point. So they actually had drafted that when Tabby was pregnant, not after the baby. It was before. So after the divorce, one was drafted saying if anything happened to George, Angela would get Vine. He said he didn't read it. He just signed his name and left. And he assumed she was making a more legit one than his handwritten one. He also had one done in Alaska and then one when he came back from Alaska. So kind of back to the wiretaps, goes back to asking if he's assumed at that time that the truck was bugged. And he said yes. He said working for R&L at that time, his mindset about the investigation was that they were trying to frame them because they didn't really have their own suspect. He said he was raised to believe law enforcement was crooked, and that's really how he is sort of explaining away his reaction to Agent Scheider and saying he wanted to hurt law enforcement members and that kind of thing. So they talk about the caffeine intake. He started taking that massive amounts of caffeine around the age of 16. Then there was a conversation about the bug detector that Billy bought and the 2 GPS trackers, which were purchased in early 2015. They have a conversation with Jake about Beth being a spy on those wiretaps. Their attorney said there was an objection and then a sidebar. So the attorney told them BCI would stoop to any level to get information out of them, and they may try to send a woman into Jake or George's life to get close and maybe get them to open up about the murders. And that's what the conversation, according to George, was about. George said he didn't know Jake, and George said Beth did not know Jake long and got married super quick, so that raised some alarms with him. Then they talk about parenting the kids, and he said he and Jake did not have the same idea about how to raise their kids. He said not by a long shot. He said Jake wanted to keep Sophia basically chained up in the house until she graduated college. Well, there's an objection. Prosecutor Canepa was throwing out the objections today. George said for him, he spoiled Vine rotten, never told him no, got him what he wanted. And he said that the family gave him a lot of grief for that. He said, Vine's going to grow up and make mistakes. He said, I've made plenty. George's way was to build a big lake, have a cabin for Vine if he ever got wild and wanted to drink. And that way he's in one spot. George would know where he is, and he's not running up and down the road like George did. And he said that the way he wanted to raise Vine was a big argument starter between him and Jake often. George discussed the reasons Jake was marrying Beth and if he was being truthful about why. He talks about the lawyers they hired. He said Clark was reserved if they ever got arrested, and George didn't know at the time he could not do a case of this magnitude. Then George goes on to say he said, and then there's an objection. So the conversation where he tells Angela she would get the best attorney, George said he said that because Angela was the one who watched the kids all the time. And he thought it would be easier on the kids having this huge trauma happen where, essentially George and Jake and Billy are gone, and that it would give the kids some normalcy to just have her in place. So if they could get her the best lawyer, maybe she would have a chance of getting out and being with the kids. Angela talks about being framed on one of those wiretaps, and Angela and Jake said that from the beginning, and they were twisting things to kind of push their narrative onto George. George said Jake and Angela were lying to him from the very beginning, and he didn't tell Angela. He said he never told Angela he would take the blame for all 8 murders. He said it didn't happen. The text between him and Josie about how close the family was, which I thought this is going to come back in, I think, on Cross. She was talking about moving to Ohio, and he wanted her to know because he was close with his family, and she understood because she was the same way. When they talk about George telling Jake, every time I do something, you rat me out. And he said he's referring to his childhood because Jake was always tattling. In another recording, George said, everyone's out to get us. He said he meant all the comments online, and he felt everybody really was against them. Angela said on the recording, they're framing us and she will take the death penalty over life in prison. And remember, Jake said, well, they can arrest me and give me life, but that just means I've got 60 years to get out. At that time, George said, again, he did not know they had committed these murders. George said, ain't going to have the electric chair. He said he just got irritated when George said that he wasn't going to have the electric chair. He said he just got irritated when people were messing with his family. He said, on top of that, when he made those comments, he had no sleep and he was hyped up on coffee. He admits to saying, I'm going to kill you, Ryan, and says when you're angry, you just say things you don't mean. Another recording, he remembers hearing Jake calling the boss about the family emergency after seeing the gun text from Agent Scheider said, I need you to come talk to me ASAP. So he wanted to get back to talk to the attorney. And he explains if you want a direct route to get home, you say family emergency. Otherwise, you have to still make stops and unload. He said in saying it was a family emergency, that would have saved them about 10 hours on the road and got home sooner. And they talk about Angela telling George not to talk on the phone. And George said that Angela said it 100 times to him. And their attorney also advised them of this. It wasn't just her. They bring up the poisoned ice cubes that Billy said tasted like medicine and accused Beth of trying to poison them, if you remember. When George got home, he said he figured out it was really simple. The ice tray just still had Dawn dish detergent that hadn't been completely rinsed. George told Jake, you telling people the truth gets us in trouble. And George said that's because he thought Jake ticked off the Manleys. We talked about that yesterday, where Jake was insulting their home, the inside and the outside conditions of their homes, and made fun about the transmission. So he said when he made that comment, Jake, you telling people the truth always gets us in trouble. He thought the Manleys were the ones pointing the finger to BCI because of how Jake treated him. George talked about wanting to own his own farm out west. He said he was going to try to go to the Missouri terminal and move and buy a farm out there. And then talking about the Winter Olympics, which was George's own wording for it, he says he's the founding father of spotlighting deer, which is poaching. Him, Chris Newcomb, and Randa actually started that, and he didn't have time to deer hunt. And after working and spending time with Vine, he wanted the freezer to still be full of deer meat. He said he ate deer meat 2 to 3 times a day. And Defense Attorney Parker was like, a day? And he's like, a day. He said every deer he's ever shot, he has eaten, except for one that him and Chris Newcomb shot that was full of gangrene. Good call. Not eating that one. When they got back from Alaska, living on South Webster in Grandpa Carter's house, he had a conversation with Angela about the house, and there's an objection. And she asked him to do something similar to the houses on Bethel Hill to this house, and George said no. He said again, he didn't know his family was going to kill the Rodens and Hannah Gilley, and he didn't know after that they did. He reiterates he loved Hannah Mae and considered Frankie his best friend, and they show the wedding photo again of George with his arm around Frankie at his wedding. And so then we get up to cross, and I noticed yesterday that I've noticed all week, Prosecutor Canepa looks tired, and I get it. This has been a 6-year marathon for her and the other prosecutors, and I think she's tired, and it's showing physically to me. I'm behind on cross, but I have to say so far, I do not think it's going super great for the state right now. Maybe it'll pick up. I kind of wish Wilson had done the cross. He's very firm. He is loud. And so let's get through this. And I'll point out, I just think that she tries to get under his skin and he keeps his composure. And what I felt I was seeing was the prosecutor getting a little flustered because she wasn't eliciting a reaction that she wanted out of George with her line of questioning. And I also kind of feel like maybe she's focusing on the wrong things. A lot of the stuff that she really has pounded into the ground has nothing to do with the murders. And maybe it's, prior bad acts, but he explains it away. So we'll see how this picks up later. And then we've got redirect, and then we're probably going to have recross. This will not finish today. So, she starts out, you consider Frankie your best friend more than Chris Newcomb? George said, Chris Newcomb isn't my friend. He's my brother. He should have been my brother. And she said, in 2012, you have your arm around Frankie at your wedding. When did you last talk to Frankie before the homicide? And he said it was late December of 2015. So she says, at the border, you said you never met Hannah Hazel. And the last person you knew Frankie to be with is Angel. George said Angel was actually before Chelsea. And she says, you didn't even know Ruger's name at the border. And George said, I did not. So she says 9 months of being pregnant, and Ruger is 6 months old at the time of the murder. So in 15 months of Hannah Hazel being pregnant and giving birth, you never met her. And he said, I don't know if he said he did or not. I could have swore he said he met her once yesterday. I'll have to go back and look at my notes. And she said, but Frankie was your best friend. And George said, I considered him my best friend. Canepa says, the best friend you blocked on Facebook. And George said, I did not block him on Facebook. And he also acknowledges he didn't message Frankie on there either. So she says the age difference between you and Frankie is 3.5 to 4 years. Your best friend is 4 years younger than you, and you hung out with him and drank with him at Big Bear Lake. And you're the only friend who says Frankie drank. She says, you say you saw the crime scene photos with no alcohol in his house. And I thought that was a little bit of a reach, because there's a difference between partying when you're a teenager and then not having it all over your house when you have a fiance and 2 very small kids. For me, you're trying to make George look bad in saying that he drank with Frankie back when Frankie was an early teen. And then she's comparing that to much later when this man has 2 children of his own. I'm curious what the jury is thinking right now on this cross. George said he never actually bought Frankie alcohol either. It was somebody else. So at the border, you said you went to Big Bear Lake when you were attending diesel mechanic school. And George said it was like a summer and a half or 2 summers. And he said more like a summer and a half because eventually Jake got them kicked out. He didn't elaborate with what Jake did to get him kicked out. And then Chelsea, which is the mother of Frankie's first baby, testified you reached out to her at some point and Frankie found out and was upset. I think maybe that's where that text came in yesterday that they never elaborated on what Frankie texted him about that morning, cussing him out, and then they ended up met up. But the prosecutor said Chelsea's lying when she said you and Frankie both held a grudge after that text. Are you saying she's lying? And George said, I'm not saying she's lying. I'm saying she is mistaken. And you never met Hannah Hazel. You don't know Ruger's name. And George said, no. Prosecutor said, you said Frankie was a fighter. You seen videos of him fighting. You said you would have to go through Frankie to get to his family. And George said, I don't see anybody in their family allowing anyone to mess with each other. And then she talks about how strong George is, and they're kind of linking this to Kenneth. You lifted an engine block by yourself, and you said that Kenneth was stronger than a bull ox, and George said he was more than that. He was really super strong. And then she goes back to childhood. You committed an unlimited number of offenses with your family. George says, more than I can count. She says they make decisions when they agree if it's good to take a load or not. And he said, yeah, they would open it up, look what's inside, and then they would agree if they were going to take it or not. So then she asks about when Billy would take them around spotting surveillance cameras. She says trail cams, and George actually corrects her. She said, you got $1 if you saw one? And George said, no, that was if we spotted a cop. With surveillance, if they didn't spot it, Billy wouldn't tell them where it was. He would loop around and make a circle until the boys found it. So then if they missed that surveillance, they would get the 4-wheeler taken away. That was when George was around 14 that they were doing that. And he said when they were inside stores, they would look for them or just driving down the road. So BCI thought you used the infrared to spot trail cams, and George said the infrared that he had was for poaching deer. And so she says, you bought the night scope, and George said, technically, my dad bought it. He said Billy bought it as a gift, and George was with him at Bass Pro when they got it. She said, doesn't fall of 2015 sound correct? And he said yes. So again, you're talking about purchases that were made way before the murders were even thought of, according to whatever everybody's testified to. It was after that December 2015 message that in January the plan went into place. So you look, these people have the equivalent of a Cabela's in their house, apparently. I mean, deer heads and all on the wall, firearms, ammo, camo, scent stuff. So I just think that if people on that jury are familiar with hunting and they know what tools you need or you use when you're hunting. I don't know that any of this is going to be really significant to them, especially if it was bought like in 2015. It's going to seem like a reach to sort of try to tie that into the murders because, I don't know. So she hands him an exhibit and asks if he recognizes a purchase. And he says something about AT&X sites. The price was $641. It was paid in cash by Billy, and they used Jake's rewards card. Remember, they would, at the end of the year, cash that rewards card in and use that money for Christmas gifts. But Billy did pay for that. George said he mainly shopped at Bass Pro. That was about it. She asks about the chop shop operation. He started doing this when they lived at Peterson, and the last one that he did was in early of 2016. He did maybe 5 total. So we know these people would report the car stolen. The company would pay off their loan. George did not personally know any of the people he chopped their cars for. They were sent to him by his grandpa Carter. And then she says Bernie Brown had an arson. And remember, Bernie's the neighbor they stored the trailers on. He testified off camera early this week as who they helped on the farm. George said his personal understanding of it was that it was an accident and doesn't believe it was set on purpose. And then George asks if she wants details. So he said, I'll tell you this. Billy had a method of burning a vehicle. Bernie's was still standing. If Billy had done it, there would be a frame left and nothing else. Bernie's caught fire on the inside and it put itself out. It kind of smothered itself. Then they move on to the intentional wreck with Chris Newcomb and Jake. George said it wasn't because he needed the money for the truck, but him and Chris needed money just in general. And they agreed to split the insurance costs because they were both kind of hard up for cash. George said he knows that's a crime. And the prosecutor says, because you testified yesterday, you stopped your life of crime. And George said, that's not what I said. And Canepa says, what did you say? And George says, I said I gave up busting into trailers and stealing fuel because I didn't want to look over my shoulder anymore. George said this was the first time actually he had tried something without his family, and he said it failed miserably. Without family help, he means without Angela and Billy's way of doing it, of them setting it up, planning it. So she says, you said your dad bought Jake the truck of his dreams before he could drive, and you got a $2,500 truck. But Billy gave you a motorcycle and scopes. Are you saying Jake was the favorite? George said, I don't hold that against my dad. I hold it against my mom. It was my dad's money, and my mom made him buy that truck for Jake. But Jake was Angela's favorite. So the prosecutor says, at the border, you said they never gave me a reason to think Jake was her favorite. He said, as far as talking wise, it's not true. But as far as Jake getting what he wanted, it was true that he was the favorite. So she says, growing up, you drank. Jake didn't. He was helping with chores. You weren't. You were drinking at a young age. Jake wasn't. And she says, that's not an unusual request of a parent to not want their kid to go drink at such a young age of 12 or 13. And George said, that's normal for a parent to not want their kid to do that, obviously. So she says, you said you didn't want Vine to do half the things you did growing up. And George said, do I want him to? No. Is he going to? More than likely. Every child does. And then he said, except for one child, I knew who didn't. And I think he was referring to Jake, although he did not name him. He who must not be named. You talk about Jake yesterday as if you didn't like him. And George said early childhood wasn't bad, but as they grew older, it got much worse. He said he would have 10 good days with Jake out of 100. And she brings up texting Josie and telling her you were close with your family and you wanted to be sure she was aware of that before she moved down. And George said he thought she may move there, but he didn't want her to live in the house with Angela. So on the July 2018 wiretaps, she says, you talk about the farm out west where you say me and Jake and you can live peacefully with whoever else wanted to live there. George asks if he can explain. And he said he envisioned everyone having their own homes on the property together, but not living together. So she says in July 2018, you wanted to go out west, even though you had just come back from Ohio or to Ohio. And she also said there was talk of Josie understanding what the kids had been through and she would be fine to live with you guys. So she asked him to describe Angela, and he said he said Angela thinks she's better than everyone and everything has to be done her way. He said she is selfish and very manipulative. He said, and she said, well, this is different from what you said at the border stop. You were asked if your mom was controlling. And one of the border agents said to him, I bet she organized the whole thing. And George said that not at all. She's not controlling. And George said, up until the age of 10, she wasn't controlling. It got worse as he got older. And George said, she tried to control me, but I did my own thing. When asked about the dynamics and who ran the house, George said, technically my mom. And it was her house. And so the prosecutor says, you and Jake. And mom just stays there because she had the health issues and watched the kids. So when asked who always gets their way, who's in charge, you said that kind of goes between me and my brother over my parents. And George said, I don't remember pulling Jake into it. I did what I wanted to do. So they move on to talk about hunting on the weekends. And Angela's thinking he should be hanging with Vine more. Angela said, you should move out and I'll take care of Vine. George said that was after Alaska when they were living on South Webster. So then they moved to the custody documents. Your discussion was in the kitchen. And George said, yeah, I signed my name and I left. And you signed it and you trust your mom. And George said he trusts her 70 to 80% of the time. George said, who else would I leave Vine to if something happened to me? He said, I have no one else to leave him to. And the prosecutor says, you signed them in April of 2016. And George said, I don't know the dates. I just signed it. I didn't pay attention to when it was printed. Remember, at the very, very bottom in small print, tells you the date it was printed. So she hands him the custody document and he says, yeah, I signed it. And she shows him the date at the bottom and how it's printed. And George says, I don't use computers. I don't know about that. He said, I signed it the day it was printed off. And we know the documents became an issue in the investigation. And so George had a talk with grandma to remind her that she had been there when Hannah Mae stopped by and wanted a typed version of that. And then the prosecutor said, your mom is talking to Rita, reminding her of a conversation you had with her about that. George said, hey, if you have a copy of that transcript, I can jog my memory. And so she hands him the transcript and he reads over it. George said he never talked to his grandmother about this. And the prosecutor says Angela is reminding her mom about your conversation with her, but you don't remember having it. On the wiretaps, you were worried about the grand jury. Why were you worried? And George said, I was raised not to trust law enforcement. So the prosecutor says, you know, it's illegal to sign a backdated document. And George said, I signed my name. He said, I mean, if it's illegal, it's illegal. And I get that if it was backdated. But she said for me to sign my name, I did. And then I walked out. Then the prosecutor said you had lots of conversations about the handwriting samples. And George says because it dealt with law enforcement, it was just one of the elements that made him uncomfortable that they were being framed. She said, you were raised to commit a lot of crimes. And George said, yeah, I realized until I realized it was wrong. And so the prosecutor says you didn't swear off a life of crime. You didn't swear off a life of crime. And she said, what about loan fraud? You said you worked at Flying W Farms on this form. And George said, I did work there part-time. Then she brings up, this is another one of those really petty things that just, I understand where she's trying to pull it into, but she just literally kind of stayed on it. And okay, so you filled out a document for your driver's license that had a false address saying that you resided on Oak Hill. And George said, I stayed at my grandpa's house and I did use the Oak Hill address. She shows him the document. He acknowledges he did not live there when he signed that document. Maybe it had something to do with R&L and getting hired. And the prosecutor said it was also about wanting to hide from Tammy for the 1-year abandonment deadline. Isn't that right? George said, I didn't try to keep her from knowing I was back. My attorney did not want her to know I was back. So the prosecutor says, when you guys didn't want Beth to get a job in the area because Tabby's family worked there, George said, I wasn't involved in anything about her job. His lawyer said if Tabby didn't contact Vine for a year, it would qualify for abandonment. And George said he was waiting on the 1-year mark. So if she tried starting her stuff he knows she filed some things later on BCI's advice as well. So the prosecutor goes back to that. You say when she starts her stuff, you mean her seeking to have contact with her son? And George said no, by having her mom and her sister see him. And the prosecutor says, well, Tabby tried. You said yesterday you tried for 6 weeks to patch things up and you found out she was cheating and you said it was over. You had already filed for the dissolution. And George says they were starting from ground zero. Yes. So she hands him a document from 2014 in November, where 2 weeks after Tabby left him, he had a legal document prepared. And George said, we agreed to try to fix it. And if it was fixed before that hearing came up, then we would drop it and not go through with it. But she said it was finalized 2 months later. So stuff like that with the driver's license, she went longer on that, just saying you put the wrong address on your driver's license. Okay, I get that. But you're really taking kind of the focus off of trying to break down. Really, the central thing for her has got to be to put him there the night of the murders, trip him up, make him say something. You know what I'm saying? And it's just, she is focusing on, and you'll see here in a minute, little things like this. So she reads the custody agreement saying you did not honor that custody agreement. And she says, so why is it in March she sends you certified mail asking to go see your son? George literally turns to Judge Deering and says, Your Honor, may I go into detail with this? And he said, answer the question. He said, she canceled as many times as I did. The majority of her cancellation is because she wanted to bring her mom or her sister with her. And so she asked George, you felt her mom contributed to this? And George said her mom held her down. The prosecutor said, you weren't there. And George said, I had her mom tell me this from her own mouth. So then you kind of see Canepa get a little flustered. Really, I think the trying to get under her skin when he doesn't, it's like a boomerang effect. And it seems like she's getting flustered. So hopefully she's picked it back up now. The prosecutor, this was another one that just really, I was like, what? She said, you never filed charges. And George said, I was under the impression that if the girls didn't cooperate, nothing would be done. And then the prosecutor said, I would think someone confessing to you would be powerful. And that's not how it works. I can go report somebody was assaulted, but if that person doesn't want to cooperate, no matter how powerful my statement to authorities is, you have to have the cooperation of that victim, unless that victim is a minor, unless I'm wrong. I mean, it was kind of one of those things, I think, just kind of came out. So she said, regardless, her sisters were victims. They didn't abuse anyone. And George said, no, they didn't abuse anyone. So she said, why not permit Vine's aunt to come visit at your house while you're there? What could have gone wrong with you there watching? George said her sisters were marrying men 30 to 40 years older and have said to him in the past, if a child gets molested, it's okay. They'll deal with it. So that made him uncomfortable. And so the prosecutor says, you have no clue what her sisters think. And George said, these are things they have said directly to me. So the prosecutor says, for people you don't really like, you sure have a lot of conversations with them. Again, just another little thing. And George comes right back and said, I spent a lot of time with them before my son was born. So the prosecutor says, again, what could have happened with you there? And George said, I can't answer that one, but I wasn't going to take any chances. The prosecutor said Tabitha believed this was temporary, and once she could provide accommodations and get her life straight, that this would change. He asked if he could go into detail, and the prosecutor said, answer the question, yes or no. And George said essentially yes, that Tabby was under that impression. Tabby did not want Vine around her stepdad either, though, he pointed out. Prosecutor said, when she tried to see him, you didn't allow it. And George said, I allowed her to see him anytime she wanted. And she says, that's not true. You just said you canceled as much as she did. And George says, well, yeah, look, I canceled for work reasons. And then when I would call her a day or two later and tell her she could come see him, she had to go somewhere with her mom or with her boyfriend, and she couldn't make it. The prosecutor says, you seen the text between Hannah Mae and Tabby where she's missing her son? And George says, I have no doubt Tabby wanted to see him, but I never kept her from seeing him. So then she hands him an exhibit of a background check for a firearm. And he had signed it. He was buying an AR-15, a gun that had nothing to do with the murders, and it was bought August 16th of 2015, way before the murders were even started to be planned. That's the weapon Billy bought that scope for a month later. So she hands him a firearm receipt from March 17th, 2016. It's a Glock 17 9mm, and he got it from Bill's Bait House. The AR was bought at Walmart. There was also a purchase form for a Beretta 92 9mm that he had bought for Billy. So they moved to Peterson in early 2014 and lived there until May of 2017. That's when they took that first trip to Alaska. You know, you're supposed to put accurate information on there, and you have the Bethel Hill address. And they're talking about this purchase of this Beretta. And so the prosecutor said, you know, that's a federal offense. And George said, my license hadn't expired, and I was told to use what address was actually on the valid driver's license that he had. And so she gets a little bit, snippy here and says, actually, that's not permitted. And George says he was told to use the address on his driver's license. So the prosecutor shows him the warning at the top of the form that you have to provide accurate information or you risk 10 years in prison if you don't. George looks at it and says that form is to determine whether or not you can own a firearm or not. So the prosecutor gives him the document about false statements, and it's a penalty under federal law. I mean, this has nothing to do with anything. It's so far away from where we need to be. We know George did shady stuff in the past. I'm not going to lie. Like, if they tell me when I went and bought my firearm, if my address is different, just use what's on your driver's license. I don't know that I would have read the fine print. But maybe I should start now that I know this. He knew the arson at Bethel Hill was arson and moved his stuff out. Frederica offered them a rental property, and he said if they found nowhere to go, the plan would be they would go there. But the prosecutor says, you went along with it, didn't you? And George said there was no stopping them with the arson. Then she says, Jake testified you were in the house. And George said, I was working on my truck. And then she says, you profited off of that fire. And George said, if you consider Peterson Road profiting, she says, it was in your name. And he said, yeah, but it was mom and dad's. We put it in our names to skip the inheritance tax if they died. And also they would have the house for collateral if they needed a loan. She said, you used Peterson to pay off your debts. And he said, we all paid off debts. And she says, she says, you've heard Tabby testify. She'll fill out the receipts when those fires happen. And George said, if she did, I wasn't aware of it. He said, Angela's done that for every place that they burned down. She would sit for hours looking up prices, writing out those receipts. And the prosecutor says that is done to increase the amount of money the insurance will pay out. And George said it gets your contents paid for. They wanted proof of what was in there. So she hands him a document, and it's a receipt. Angela's handwriting. So the prosecutor names off things on the list. She said, you never told on her? And George said, no. She said, you wouldn't have been able to buy your own house without that money. And George said, no, not in cash. So in other words, you didn't tell the authorities that your family burnt down. What number is this that's been burnt down? George said no. Then we get to the time that George claims he went to bed the night of the murders. And he said 10-ish in his testimony yesterday. But prosecutor points out they told the border agents that the 6 of them were watching a movie, which we know was the alibi they all kind of agreed on, and didn't go to bed until 12:30. He said he just doesn't remember. It's been 6 years. He doesn't remember exactly the time he went to bed that night. So the prosecutor says Angela made cheeseburgers, and you told the agents maybe one day she could make one for them. And you said you watched a fairy movie. And he said that it was one Sophia wanted to watch. And he said, I remember watching a movie, but just not which one. And then the prosecutor says Vine went to bed at 10 to 11 p.m. And George said, is there a reason you lied to the people at the border? And George says, I don't remember what time I told them. That was years ago. The prosecutor says, now we know Chris Sr. and Gary were being killed between 10 and 11 p.m. And George said, I wasn't there. I don't know. The prosecutor says, that's what Jake said. And George said, I know Jake's timelines have been way off when he testified, which is a good point. We've all said that, amongst ourselves. So the prosecutor said, we know Chris and Gary were killed at 11, which makes your story at the border impossible. George said, I don't remember what I said at the border. The prosecutor said, you were trying your best to tell the truth at the border, and this was closer to the time of the offense, so maybe your memory was better then. And now we're 6.5 years later. Would you agree your memory would have been better then opposed to now? You weren't trying to provide a cover story for your family. So this coordinated alibi, you didn't make this up. It was the story you all came up with. And George said, my dad came down that day. My kid didn't want him to leave. The prosecutor points out that the movie they watched was bootlegged, and his name, it came from some guy named Brandon something. George said that. And the prosecutor said his name was Brandon something. The prosecutor said he's dead now. And George said, yeah, he overdosed. The prosecutor asked, how did you know him? And George said he sold movies. We have one of those guys here. Couldn't tell you his name. I could just tell you back in the day, you used to get those little bootleg, not me, allegedly. Couldn't tell you his name though. Also, the ice cream truck that came around asked me if I wanted some special kind of movies at one time too. I'm just saying, ice cream trucks and stuff, man, they peddle stuff. Yep. So you said Vine went to bed at 12:30 and he woke up and screamed for apple juice. George said this is a nightly thing a lot of times with Vine. And then he said, you said yesterday you went to bed at 10. So your son at 12:30. You're telling me you went to bed 2.5 hours earlier than him. George said, I don't remember what time he went to bed that night. The prosecutor said, you said at 12:30 he usually went to bed. And George said, no. I said, if he winds himself up and got hyper, he would usually crash out at 12:30, but his normal bedtime was much earlier than that. The prosecutor said, you were all four there watching the movie. How could Jake and Billy be on the hill killing Chris and Gary less than an hour after you went into your room? And George said, I can't answer that. The prosecutor said, did you immediately fall asleep? George was like, I don't remember. Prosecutor said, do you remember telling the agents you looked at Facebook for an hour before falling asleep? And George said, sometimes I do that. And the prosecutor said you would have heard them leave that night. You said that 15 times. You were adamant. There was no way they left and you wouldn't know. You said you would hear the neighbor down the street if he left. And George said, yeah, he drives a Dodge Diesel. It's loud. So the prosecutor said, because of where your bedroom is, you would hear anyone coming down. And George said, well, my mom and kids sound like buffalo coming down the stairs. The prosecutor said, you said you got up around 8:30 or 9. George said, no, it was daylight. The prosecutor said, you didn't say Jake was up first, and that was odd. George said, they asked me what I did that morning. I don't remember them asking me the time. She said, you owned numerous SKSs, and George says, more than I could put a number on. The prosecutor said, after the search warrant at Flying W, you said an SKS was not among the weapons, and George said it wasn't. The prosecutor said, you said Jake owned an SKS as well, and he didn't like the SKS because it jammed. And George said, yeah, an older SKS that he used jammed, but not the one George had. So she asked, who has the SKS? And he names a guy, Ben McCann. He sold an AR-15 to. She said, you left that SKS out at the border. And George said, it was sold in 2015. The prosecutor said, when Scheider wanted to talk to you about the list with the SKS, did you talk about it? George said he didn't ask about the SKS. He asked about the Walter Colt 22, 1911. And I told him to talk to my attorney. And then she said, are you aware the SKS was listed under your name? And George said at the time he wasn't aware there was an SKS involved in the murders. And Scheider only asked him about the Colt 22. And then she said, you became aware an SKS was of interest. And George said, not until after he was arrested. So that's where I left off. It was actually before lunch. So I'm going to hop back in, get on this testimony, but wanted to get this little bit out. It went 49 minutes. As you see, I'm just going to have to do this all day, maybe 2-3 episodes, because there's so much to cover and it doesn't work to try to upload a 2.5 hour video to YouTube. It takes too long. And if I wait and do it all at once, I'm going to be here till 2 again. So hope you enjoyed this first one. I'll be back in a bit. We'll cover before lunch and then right after lunch, kind of break that one up. And then that'll just leave the evening, I think. That's the best way to do it. So, all right, guys, we'll see you soon.